You think you know the story of the American Revolution? You think the fight for liberty ended at Yorktown? Think again. The true cost of freedom was not just paid in musket fire and blood on American soil, but in the shimmering, silent ports of North Africa, where the fate of the young United States was about to be decided by a fleet of terrifying privateers and a single treacherous cargo, the captured American soul.
The year was 1785. 2 years had passed since the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war with Great Britain, securing the independence of the 13 colonies. In Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, the air was thick with the heady scent of new-minted freedom and the chaotic clamor of building a republic from scratch. The focus was domestic, squabbling over state boundaries, drafting new constitutions, and trying to unify a fractious people under a weak Articles of Confederation. Few Americans spared a thought for the vast, untamed waters of the Atlantic, their attention consumed by the challenges on land. Yet on the high seas, an unforeseen and utterly devastating crisis was brewing, one that would force the fledgling government to confront the brutal realities of global power, a crisis that began with 2 forgotten ships. The first was the schooner Maria, out of Boston, captained by Isaac Stevens. Stevens was a veteran smuggler turned legitimate trader, a man whose skin was cured by salt and sun and whose navigational skills were legendary. He was on a routine, if ambitious, run, a hold full of cog and lumber, destined for the Portuguese markets. The second was the square-rigged ship Dauphin, flying the colors of Philadelphia. Her cargo was finer: Pennsylvania flour, candles, and a small precious consignment of Virginia tobacco. Her captain, Richard O'Brien, was a pious man, meticulous in his log entries, and firm but fair with his crew. Both ships, independent of one another, were sailing south of the Iberian Peninsula, nearing the Straits of Gibraltar, the narrow, vital choke point connecting the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. It was a route they now considered safe, having been for decades under the protection of the formidable Royal British Navy. But the Royal Navy was no longer America's protector. They were now rivals, and a profound, deadly shift had occurred in the global balance of power that few in the American government had anticipated.
On July 25th, the Maria was spotted. Not by a privateer of a warring European power, nor a common brigand. She was sighted by a xebec, flying a pennant emblazoned with the crescent moon and star, a Barbary corsair from the Regency of Algiers. The attack was swift and brutal. Xebecs, with their 3 lateen sails and shallow drafts, were faster and more maneuverable than the American merchantmen. They swarmed the Maria. The Algerians were led by a fearsome Rais, captain, named Musa, a man notorious for his cold efficiency and disregard for life. The untrained, poorly armed American crew had no chance. Resistance, even the slightest, was met with a flash of cold steel. 2 days later, the Dauphin suffered the same fate. O'Brien managed to fire off a single, desperate, and ultimately useless volley from a swivel gun before the corsairs were upon them, grappling hooks tearing into the Dauphin's oak hull like metal claws. 21 American seamen, captains, mates, cooks, and deckhands, were instantly stripped of their freedom. They were not sunk, they were not ransomed on the spot. They were chattel, the first harvest of a terrifying new industry that would soon define the young nation's foreign policy. The 2 ships, their American flags ripped down and tossed into the sea, were recrewed with Algerian sailors and pointed east toward the glittering, deadly shores of North Africa. The first news of the calamity reached Paris months later, in the winter of 1885, via a panicked French consul. It landed on the desk of the American minister to France, a brilliant, intensely private, and slightly weary statesman, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, living a life of refined intellectual pursuit in his Parisian villa, Hôtel de Langeac, was perhaps the worst possible man to handle a crisis requiring immediate military and financial solutions. The minister was surrounded by volumes of Enlightenment philosophy, drafting his own thoughts on republican government, obsessed with the architecture of antiquity, and enjoying the elegant, stimulating society of France. His worldview, however idealistic, was about reason, law, and diplomacy. The news of the captured Americans, now slaves of the Dey of Algiers, struck him with a shock of ice water. 21 souls, he wrote in a private letter to his closest confidant across the Channel, the minister plenipotentiary to the court of St. James's, John Adams. 21 citizens of the United States. And for what crime? For sailing the open sea. Jefferson immediately began to search for precedents, treaties, and solutions. He discovered a horrifying reality. For centuries, the Barbary states of North Africa, Tripoli, Tunis, Morocco, and Algiers, had run a state-sponsored piracy operation, financed by ransom and tribute. European powers, rather than fight them, had chosen the path of least resistance, paying tribute. Britain, France, Spain, all paid massive annual sums to keep their ships safe. When America was a British colony, they were covered by the King's tribute. Now, independent, the U.S. was a rich, unprotected target. The Dey of Algiers, Mohammed Pasha, saw the American flag not as a symbol of liberty, but as a newly painted target, ripe for plunder. He understood the economics of the situation better than any philosopher. The American government, he correctly surmised, was new, poor, and deeply divided. It had no navy to speak of. It would be forced to pay. Jefferson, in his initial diplomatic overtures, met a wall of cold-blooded avarice. He was informed that the standard price for a single American seaman was 3,000 Spanish silver dollars. Multiply that by 21, add captain's fees, fees for the ships, and gifts for the Dey's court, and the total ransom demanded was nearly $60,000. To the new U.S. government, staggering under war debt and without the power to levy federal taxes, $60,000 was an insurmountable fortune. It was a crisis that transcended finance. It was a test of the very character of the American experiment. Could a republic, founded on the principle of individual liberty, abandon its citizens to slavery? Jefferson's initial reaction was a fierce philosophical idealism. It would be cheaper to fight them, he argued to Adams. He began to draw up detailed plans for a tiny American Mediterranean squadron, small, swift frigates capable of blockading Algiers. His proposal was detailed, rational, and completely ignored by the cash-strapped Congress back home.
Meanwhile, John Adams, the pragmatic, stout-hearted statesman in London, saw the grim reality. Adams had negotiated with European courts for decades. He knew that idealism meant nothing in the face of brutal, established realpolitik. "We must pay," Adams wrote back to Jefferson, his hand heavy on the parchment. "We have no navy, sir. We have no credit. We have 21 Americans chained to an oar. We must pay the ransom, purchase the treaty, and pray to God that Congress can find the means." This exchange, Jefferson's impassioned plea for military resistance versus Adams' hard-nosed call for tribute, was the first great foreign policy schism of the United States. It was a secret debate conducted via coded diplomatic pouch, its outcome poised to define the nation's relationship with the rest of the world. The lives of 21 men, now forced into backbreaking labor on the docks of Algiers, hung in the balance. The ghost ships of Algiers had claimed not only their crews, but had also begun to shake the very foundations of the American Republic. The captured crew of the Maria and the Dauphin had been marched from the harbor to the Dey's palace, a dazzling yet utterly terrifying structure dominating the city of Algiers. The air was thick with the scent of spices, refuse, and despair. Captain Stevens, whose defiance had earned him a brutal lashing upon capture, was led into a massive, echoing audience chamber.
At the center, on a raised divan piled with cushions, sat Dey Mohammed Pasha, a man of immense girth and cold, intelligent eyes. He was surrounded by his court, janissary guards with scimitars, scribes, and the Aga, the chief of the guards, a man whose face was a study in granite cruelty. The immediate terror gave way to a chilling, systematic process. The Americans were assessed by the day's officials, their health, their age, and their profession. A good carpenter or a strong blacksmith was worth more than a mere deckhand. This was not a random act of piracy. It was a highly organized, state-controlled enterprise designed for maximum profit. The true currency of Algiers was not gold, but power, and the power of its day was built on the calculated misery of Christian captives. These 21 Americans were not just slaves, they were the day's leverage over a brand new, financially vulnerable nation. The men were stripped of their clothing and given the rough garb of slaves. Their daily life became a grinding routine of back-breaking labor. They were assigned to the construction of a new fort on the harbor's edge, hauling massive blocks of stone under the brutal Mediterranean sun. Their diet was meager, thin gruel and stale bread. Beatings were common, meted out not for malice, but for slow work or a moment's rest. Among the captives was a young cabin boy from the Dauphin named Peter Jervis, barely 16 years old. He kept a small tarnished silver cross hidden in the lining of his tunic, a final link to his mother in Philadelphia. Jervis became the unintended historian of their misery. He learned a smattering of Arabic from a slightly kinder guard, and at night, when the rest of the men were too exhausted to move, he tried to memorize every event, every cruelty, every word spoken by their captors. He felt an intense, silent pressure. If they did not survive, someone must know their fate. For the Americans, the greatest torment was the psychological warfare waged by their captors. The day's agents would occasionally offer the men a chance to convert to Islam, a sure path to freedom and a better life. It was a temptation that tested the very core of their Puritan ethics and American identity. To convert meant freedom, comfort, and survival. To refuse meant continued enslavement and the strong likelihood of death from exposure or exhaustion. The majority refused, clinging to their identity and their hope that the fledgling republic would find a way to save them. The reality was that the Dey had no intention of releasing them quickly. As the weeks turned into months and the pleas and promises of rescue from their absent government failed to materialize, the American captives began to sink into a profound, collective despair. Back in Europe, the diplomatic situation was a maddening stalemate. Adams in London was frantically trying to secure a loan to pay the ransom, but the American credit was non-existent. Jefferson, in Paris, was sending a steady stream of military policy papers back to Congress, urging the construction of a navy. But the young republic was paralyzed. The states were refusing to contribute funds. The political will to spend an astronomical sum on 21 forgotten men in a distant land was simply not there. The crisis was rapidly moving from a diplomatic headache to a profound moral catastrophe. The story of the lost Americans would not just be about their eventual freedom, but about the astonishing, desperate, and often contradictory efforts of three founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, and later Washington, to solve a problem that defined the first decade of the United States. How do you fight a global war with no money, no navy, and a government that barely agrees on its own existence? The fate of Peter Jervis and his 20 companions now rested on a treacherous game of global brinksmanship, a secret deal about to be struck, and the courage of an emissary who would be sent into the heart of the Barbary beast, a man whose mission was so sensitive that its details were deliberately omitted from nearly all U.S. government archives for over a century. Back across the Atlantic, in the cramped, politically charged halls of Congress, then meeting in New York, The news of the Barbary captures was treated not as a humanitarian emergency, but as a financial nightmare. The Articles of Confederation had established a government intentionally weak, fearful of replicating the centralized tyranny of the British Crown. Congress could request funds from the states, but it could not demand them. The result was near total insolvency. The debt from the Revolutionary War was staggering. The nation's credit was so poor that European bankers laughed at the prospect of loaning the fledgling republic money. The situation of the 21 men, now slaves in Algiers, was relegated to an extraordinary expense to be debated. The loudest voice for immediate action was Rufus King of Massachusetts, a young, powerful Federalist who saw the crisis as evidence of the need for a stronger national government. "Are we a nation," King thundered in a session filled with procedural squabbles, "if we cannot protect the lives and liberty of our own seamen upon the common seas? The Barbary states do not fear our guns, for we have none. They do not respect our flag, for it is meaningless to them. They know our weakness, and that weakness is compounded daily by our inability to raise a paltry sum for the redemption of our brothers." His opponents, the anti-federalists, led by men skeptical of strong central power, argued that paying a ransom would establish a dangerous precedent. Nathaniel Gorham countered, "If we pay tribute to the Dey of Algiers, we open the treasury to every petty prince who captures a longboat. We must be prudent. The price of liberty abroad cannot be the bankruptcy of liberty at home." The debate stalled. Months slipped by. The $60,000 ransom was deemed impossible. The humanitarian crisis was turning into a national disgrace. During this period of paralysis, the captives became a tool for those advocating a complete overhaul of the government, the very men who would soon push for the Constitutional Convention. The Barbary crisis became a secret, powerful talking point. The government cannot even save its own people. A new constitution must be written. The fate of the Maria and Dauphin crews was a lever to pry open the door to a unified American Navy and a federal power structure. But for John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in Europe, politics was too slow. They needed a direct solution. Frustrated by Congress's inertia, they pooled their diplomatic discretionary funds, a tiny sum, and devised a desperate last-resort plan. They needed an agent of exceptional skill, courage, and secrecy. The man chosen for this impossible mission was an individual both deeply connected to the American cause and utterly untrustworthy to many of the Founding Fathers. John Ledyard. Ledyard was an American traveler and adventurer of legendary, almost mythic energy. He had sailed with Captain James Cook on his final, fatal voyage around the world. He had walked across Siberia. He was a man of restless intelligence, capable of learning languages rapidly and navigating the most treacherous political and physical landscapes. But he was also a man of debts, grand schemes, and questionable judgment. A perfect secret agent, precisely because his frequent disappearances and dubious reputation would make his failure easily deniable. Jefferson, who was always drawn to bold, unconventional thinkers, wrote to Ledyard, who was then languishing in London, penniless and looking for his next grand adventure. The minister laid out the mission with brutal clarity. Travel under a completely separate identity to Marseille, and then by the first available vessel to Algiers. Assess the precise number and condition of the American captives. Attempt to open direct, personal negotiation with the Dey's chief scribe or a high-ranking janissary, bypassing the official channel, which they knew was inflated. If a small-scale secret ransom could be negotiated, say for the release of the captains or the youngest slaves, Adams would attempt to send the funds via a trusted European banker. Ledyard accepted immediately. For him, it was not just a mission of patriotism, but a spectacular challenge and a chance for redemption.
Adams reluctantly approved the choice, noting in his diary, "Ledyard is a man of vast talent and possibly vast madness. If he succeeds, we are saved a great humiliation. If he fails, the folly will be his own." Ledyard, traveling with only a small purse of Spanish dollars and a forged French passport, slipped out of London in the autumn of 1866. His journey was a frantic race against time, bureaucratic delay, and the Mediterranean winter. He knew that the longer the Americans remained captive, the more likely they were to die of disease, exhaustion, or despair.
Ledyard's arrival in Algiers was unremarkable, which was, in itself, a minor miracle. He posed as a French physician seeking remedies in the ancient markets, a cover that allowed him access to various segments of the port city society. His first priority was confirming the situation of the captives. He found a Jewish merchant, a key figure in the ransom economy of Algiers, who was willing to talk for a steep fee. The merchant, named Moses Ben Haim, spoke broken English and provided the chilling update that Adams and Jefferson had desperately sought. The American slaves were in terrible condition. 3 men had already died of fever. Captain Stevens was surviving by using his carpentry skills to build decorative fittings for the day's new pleasure barge, earning slightly better treatment, but living under constant surveillance. Young Peter Jervis, the cabin boy, was a scullery worker in the day's kitchen, a terrible existence that nonetheless kept him alive and indoors. The total number of American captives was now 18. Ledyard's attempts to open a separate channel of negotiation were met with subtle but firm resistance. Dey Mohammed Pasha was a master of the ransom game. He knew exactly what the Americans were doing. He deliberately made the captives' conditions slightly better whenever he suspected a foreign agent was lurking, thus demonstrating that he held the power of life and death, and that only a full official ransom would secure their permanent release. Ledyard learned the true, brutal cost of American inaction. The Dey was using the American captives as a demonstration of weakness to the other European powers. "The American flag," the merchant Haim whispered to Ledyard, "is a gift to the Dey. He says, look at them. They talk of liberty, but they abandon their own to chains. Better to pay us than to rely on such a weak master." This information, that the Dey was using the American captivity to undermine the prestige of the young nation, was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It elevated the crisis from a ransom problem to an existential threat to America's reputation. Ledyard, realizing that he neither had the money nor the authority to buy their freedom, sent a coded, disheartened message back to Jefferson and Adams. "The Dey will not be trifled with. He demands the tribute or he demands the lives. There is no middle course." The agent, having completed his reconnaissance and failed in his negotiation, left Algiers in the dead of night, narrowly escaping the notice of the Dey's janissaries. His mission had cost a small sum of money, but it had yielded a truth more valuable than gold. The United States must either fight or perpetually pay. The secret report of John Ledyard, smuggled back to Jefferson in Paris, landed in the midst of a radical new development: the ongoing efforts to draft the U.S. Constitution. The plight of the Algerian captives would now move from a forgotten expense to a central, unstated reason for the creation of a strong federal navy, a navy that could finally confront the Barbary terror.